So welcome everyone to this session on learning to adapt humanitarian action to the effects of climate change. We're grateful to have you all here from your different regions of the world to talk about this global issue. My name is Jennifer Doherty. I'm a Senior Research Officer at ALNAP. This whole ALNAP meeting is focused on learning that emerges from a disruption. We know that disruption can create fertile ground for learning as organizations and individuals adapt their approaches to the changes that are happening around them. We discussed in the opening session yesterday whether change in the humanitarian system, particularly transformational change, is affected more by external forces than planned internal shifts or by individual efforts. In this discussion today, we will be considering the role of climate change and the extent to which significant disruptions, such as heat waves and tropical storms, have given rise to new learning over the last 18 months or so. We will also be discussing the extent to which this learning may be indicative of future sustained change within the sector or not. We're excited in this session to be launching ALNAP's new lessons paper that focuses on adapting humanitarian action to the effects of climate change. We're joined by two of the paper's authors, Veronique de Geoffroy and Mihir Bhatt, who will tell us more about the paper. But we're also grateful to their co-authors, Paul Knox-Clark from Prepare and Francois Grunwald from Groupe for their essential contributions. Following the introduction to the themes of the paper, we will have a panel discussion where our three other panelists, Adenike, Oladosu, Carol Devine and Erin Perez, will reflect on how some of the lessons in the paper relate to their own work on climate change. We will have a longer opportunity for Q&A at the end, but there will also be some opportunities to field audience questions throughout the session. As such, please do submit your questions into the Q&A box. The Q&A box is on the right of the screen. You need to pick polls at the top and then Q&A underneath on the left. Please also upvote other questions that you would like to hear answered by the panel. And please do tell us if you would like your question answered by a specific panelist. If you're joining us by Zoom, you can still engage in the Q&A on the Jumbo platform if you've reduced the size of the Zoom window and then switch between the two. We also have a Miro board available that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. You can either keep this open at the bottom or open it up in another tab to view it. We'll be using the board to take notes around key themes emerging in the discussion, but please do add your own notes if you have something additional you want to highlight. And finally, for those of you on Twitter, please feel free to tweet about the session using the meeting Twitter handle, #ALNAP21. So I will now introduce you to our first panelists, two of the authors of the lessons paper. Veronique de Geoffroy is Groupe URD's Executive Director. She has worked in the humanitarian sector for many years, starting with NGOs in different countries in the 1990s. She currently carries out studies concerning the effectiveness of aid and the architecture of the humanitarian system. Mihir Bhatt is the Executive Director of the All India Disaster Management Institute. He leads their cascading risk and resilience work in cities and districts in India and in South Asia through humanitarian response, DRR, climate and conflict agenda shaping, and co-learning activities with affected communities. It's been a real pleasure working with both of you on the lessons paper, and it's great to have you here today to discuss it. So first, I would like to ask Veronique to tell us about the types of climate-related disasters that have been experienced globally in the past 2 years and what that has meant for humanitarian actors.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane, for giving me the opportunity to share some of the key results of this research. I think this lessons paper is really timely as the subject of adapting humanitarian aid to climate change is still emerging and will call for much more effort from the entire humanitarian community. So to come back to your question, when asking a group of practitioners this question at the very beginning of the research, we heard about different types of disasters and organized them into 3 categories. So the first category is those disasters we already know about, such as floods, droughts, cyclones, etc. Of course, they are getting more frequent or stronger due to the effect of climate change. But humanitarian agencies know how to respond to them, even if they may need to adapt to changes or intensity or locations. the two other categories are much more interesting. The second one is those disasters that are not well understood because they have new characteristics due to the effect of climate change. For example, cyclones developing much faster or behaving in new ways, changing their trajectory, such as Hurricane Matthew did in Haiti in 2016. Or another example, the droughts, which are increasingly protracted over several seasons all over the world. So faced with these imperfectly understood disasters, best practice responses drawn from previous experience, such as programs to maintain livestock health during periods of drought, may no longer be practical, appropriate, or effective. And the third category, those disasters we don't know about and which are leading us to an unknown future. Extreme heat waves exemplify this type of disaster, as there are very few documented events and a very limited number of lessons from which to draw. And climate change may lead to complex disasters that have unpredictable cascading effects across economic and social structure and infrastructure, not to mention the impact on our entire ecosystem. The world has not yet experienced a comparable climate-related cascading crisis, even if the events this last summer with extreme heat waves and wildfires in North America, floods in Europe, drought in Madagascar, in the context of a pandemic, is giving an idea of what some call systemic crisis. And this is the challenge for humanitarian aid, getting prepared for the unknown.
Thank you, Veronique. So those are some of the challenges and the threats being faced. How does this new lessons paper try to support humanitarian actors in adapting to these different kinds of threats?
So this lessons paper aims to draw learning from literature and expert knowledge about changes required in humanitarian action at policy, institutional and operational levels to take account of the effects of climate change. It is then divided into three sections. The first one presents general lessons on humanitarian action and climate change based on a literature review of policy documents, including of resilience and anticipatory programming. The second section presents lessons from responses to imperfectly understood disaster, based on a literature review of responses to tropical storm behaving in new ways as an example of imperfectly understood disaster. And the third section presents lessons from responses to unknown disasters based on a literature review of responses to heat waves as an example of unknown disasters. We decided not to prioritize the issue of mitigating the environmental footprint of humanitarian aid, as a lot is already being done, including by the Joint Environmental Unit, the Red Cross movement around the Climate and Environmental Charter, Groupe and other stakeholders. So there are a total of 40 key lessons applying to anticipatory action and response programming, from resilience building, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, to early warning, emergency response and recovery. However, identifying specific lessons and recommendations that might help to inform future humanitarian response was challenging, given that the exercise was rooted in reviewing past experiences, and the challenges of dealing with climate change lie ahead in the future and are still largely unknown. So humanitarian actors have to learn on the spot as they respond to new type of climate-related disasters. And lessons from this paper will be useful, but many other lessons will emerge, and learning must therefore become an integrated element of adaptive management. It is also important to note that this learning will emerge from and apply to responses in different parts of the world, not only developing or low-income countries. This paper largely excludes the experiences of developed countries, However, they are increasingly subject to climate-related emergencies and vulnerable to their effects. Moreover, a higher level of economic development does not act as an automatic safety net in the event of a climate-related disaster. Solutions and responses explored or tested in lower or middle-income countries may be equally appropriate in developed countries for all kinds of actors beyond humanitarians. So there is scope for learning exchange between all countries and regions affected by extreme weather events, to share ideas on issues such as resilience, anticipation, and response. So this could be the subject of a further discussion paper, and it is already something we are working on at Groupe and together with the newly born Prepare initiative.
Fantastic. Thank you, Veronique. So that's a good overview of what people can find in the paper, but also its broader applicability and what's left for us to learn still. So I'll now ask Mihir to dive a bit more deeply into some of the themes in the paper. So Mihir, heat waves are discussed in the paper as an unknown type of disaster, but heat waves is not an entirely new term. Can you explain in what way heat waves are seen as unknown?
Yes, the heat wave is not entirely unknown, and that's true. But I think it is limitedly known within the humanitarian sector, within the humanitarian system. And that's something that this paper has, lessons learned paper has quite directly found out. It is limitedly known in terms of action, that is how things are implemented on the ground. But it's also limitedly known in terms of how the research and learning around that is not adequate for us to take any more informed action. So in these both ways, it is quite limitedly known. Also, for example, what is missing in humanitarian sector, we don't see much of heat wave planning or examples of heat wave plans across the agencies, authorities, for example, donor plans, for example. You don't see much of the heat wave budgets. What do they look like? What kind of items are there when you do a heat wave response? What you put in, what you not? And that's something, and that way it's not known. It is also not known in terms of what kind of monitoring you need when you are doing the heat wave response and how that monitoring should be taking place. Or for that matter, there are hardly any evaluations of heat wave response, and we can't draw from there to inform our future plans or future actions. So that way it is relatively unknown. It is also unknown in terms of finding very limited financing, that how do you finance heat wave response, but also mitigation, preparedness, and other aspects. And there isn't enough work done that. Or if you are a donor, how do you allocate budgets for heat wave related response? And there isn't much that we found. So again, it is unknown from that point of view. There is also an emerging area which needs more which will need more finance, because there are more and heat waves are happening with more frequency, as they found out. Heat waves are happening with greater spread in terms of geographic locations, but also in terms of new communities. And also heat waves are happening more acutely than they have happened before. And this we haven't known. So in short, I'd like to sum up to say that it's a dynamic experience which is changing very rapidly, and the way we are capturing it is somewhat slow, if not delayed or retarded. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihir. I think you are a little quiet, so if you could shout up a bit, that would be really helpful. I think that's a great distinction to make about those terms, and while it's relatively common usage, they've not typically been seen as the type of disasters that require humanitarian action on the scale that we now need to be prepared for, and we need to get to know these types of disasters. The paper also talks about the risk of compound crises and the challenge when climate-related disasters interact with other forms of disaster. Are you seeing this in the Indian context, and in what way can the lessons in the paper help organizations to deal with that complexity?
Yes, thanks for asking this. And what we found while doing the paper is that there is heat wave which is compounding. It is also cascading, and it is also co-location. So all these three things happen related to heat wave, and we need to be aware of that. For example, this has not only happened in India, it is applicable to South Asia as well, and also to the Asian context. So I think it's a very widespread use of this paper that we can see. We see a sequence, typical sequence of heat wave, then heat wave and heat wave. And in a one season, three of them, and that's something we are not prepared for. We see the heat wave, cyclone, heat wave, and we are not prepared for that. And we have seen that last 2 years. We have seen heat wave, drought, flood, and heat wave, and again, we are not prepared for that. And then we have heat wave and new risks such as salinity increase. And how does that help us or not help us address what we need to address? So it is compounding, it is cascading, and it is also co-location of heat wave that is coming out from this particular paper. And the way the agencies can address that, is at the policy level to see that there are policies in place to have the heat wave response, to have strategy, institutional strategy, to have programs developed beforehand, and types of projects, a menu of projects that are possible now to put together, and perhaps Groupe URD and newly from Perez will be doing that. Monitoring and evaluating. What are the tools of evaluating heat wave impact related response and so on and so forth. And also how do you do the budgeting? And that's very, very important. There is not enough experience around that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mihir. I think your comments may resonate with audience members in other regions that are also experiencing these multiple disasters. So we do have a space now to ask a question to the lessons papers authors. I can see one question in the chat already, which is, can we get a link to the paper? So that's in the Q&A. If you go up to the top and you click the chat button for this room, it will show a link to the paper that Danny has put in there for you. So you can read it afterwards. So I'm just seeing if there's any other questions coming through for Mihir and Veronique. So I think one that my colleague has passed to me. So how much are the lessons in the new paper about humanitarian actors making incremental changes to their existing practices versus needing to see a more transformative revolution in practice? So that's for Mihir.
I think this is my feeling that the paper quite clearly says that incremental changes will not be enough. We'll really need a very proactive, upfront, direct confrontation with the things we are facing and are about to face even more rapidly and even more devastatingly. So transformative changes would be far more effective than incremental changes. There is no time for that. And that's what the paper says. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be taking incremental changes that we are doing. That needs to be continued, but accelerated, and think of other ways of addressing that. Veronique.
Thank you. So while we might be starting incrementally, there is much more of a push for us to move more towards this revolution we've been talking about in the meeting to really get things going on this topic. Great. Thank you to both Mihir and Veronique, and there will be an opportunity for more questions with them towards the end of the session. But for now, I'll introduce our other panelists so we can hear about how some of the lessons in the paper relate to their work. So our first panelist is Erin Perez. Erin is a Dignitas Professor at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University and a Senior Advisor for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Her work focuses on anticipating the extreme events and supporting humanitarian teams develop early action protocols. Erin was also a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report. So Erin, the paper contains several lessons related to early warning systems for climate-related disasters. For example, the recommendation that forecasting and early warning systems should be continuously and rigorously reviewed after each disaster event and routinely reviewed at fixed intervals over the longer term, and that there should be flexibility to these systems. So how do these recommendations relate to your own research and your work with humanitarian organizations?
Thank you, and thank you for hosting such a interesting panel focused on this really fascinating report. Congratulations to the people who wrote the report. When it comes to early warning, early action, I think that this is one of the key recommendations that has come out of this report, because we see a lot of enthusiasm for the concept, and people have a lot of interest in prevention is better than cure, et cetera, et cetera. And so it resonates in a very obvious way. However, prevention is not better than cure if your preventative action is useless. And so we need to be holding ourselves to a high standard here, saying, as the humanitarian sector, we have some sense of what kind of actions post-disaster have what kind of benefit for whom. But pre-disaster, we don't have that sense automatically. So we have some theories of change saying, in this context, if people receive a cash transfer pre-disaster, our theory is that they will be able to use it for this, this, and this, and be able to avoid the impacts of the upcoming flood or drought or whatever. But we don't really know, right? And we are creating these theories, and we are trying to provide pre-disaster support with this forecast-based financing, early warning, early action, anticipatory action systems. But we need to evaluate it, and we need to ask ourselves, did people A, get left behind? So were we not able to forecast the correct impact on the correct populations, and perhaps we helped populations that were better off and left behind people who didn't fit properly in our model? Or were we providing support that turned out not to be very helpful? So were we providing agricultural inputs to a population that didn't need, they had agricultural inputs and what they really needed was cash, for example, or whatever it is. So doing rigorous post-action evaluations is important. So in terms of relation to my own research, I am on this edge of academia and the humanitarian sector with my academic hat on at Tufts University. We have created a new consortium. We're calling it the Academic Alliance on Anticipatory Action. And it's a consortium of Tufts University here in the United States, plus the Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology, the University of the Philippines, the National University of Lesotho, Eduardo Mondlane University in Mozambique, University of Namibia, and Makerere University in Uganda. So our 7-university consortium has stepped up to the plate and said that we would be willing to help the humanitarian sector with these impact evaluations from a more academic perspective. And so USAID, the BHA, has kindly provided funding for this, and we're kicking off as of about a month ago to try to be available to the humanitarian sector, work with our partners, and do these kinds of evaluations post-disaster. Then your second point was basically on how we can be flexible when we do these kinds of things. And I think that when it comes to flexibility, we need to make sure we're paying a lot of attention to the localization agenda. So our goal is to push people to act early and to create roles and responsibilities for early action so that people know that it is their job and they need to be doing this. But really to devolve decision-making and choices to people on the ground who are in charge of what they're doing. They should have flexibility and they should be able to act appropriately when they receive early warnings. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Erin. So I think a lot of that was on the importance of partnerships. So partly with locally led action, but also this partnership between academia and practitioners. And your academic alliance sounds like quite a force. So we look forward to hearing more from these impact evaluations that you've done. So Erin will need to leave us a little bit early, so please do get your questions in for her into the Q&A, and we'll try to take one of those before she goes. But for first, we'll speak to Adenike. Adenike Oladosu is an ecofeminist, climate justice activist, and eco-reporter from Nigeria. She is the founder of I Lead Climate, which is a youth-led movement focused on climate change-induced problems in conflict zones. Adenike, the lessons paper highlights that humanitarian actors should consider the impact of climate change in regions experiencing armed conflict and find ways to work with both development actors and governments to deliver climate-related programming in these areas. So how does conflict interact with climate change in Nigeria, and how are people responding to overcome those complex challenges?
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm honored to be here to speak on these issues that is defining our time. And the fact that climate change in Africa is already leading to armed conflicts. Nigeria is one of those severely hit countries that are facing the worst part of armed conflicts, because we have been seeing it through the clashes between the farmers and the herdsmen. Because I schooled in the food basket of the nation. And in the food basket of the nation, we have vegetative covers, we have fertile landscape, and which it's a all year round thing because they have enough grazing sites and roads like that. And that is why they gave them that name called the food basket of the nation. So over time, due to the drought in the northeastern part of Nigeria, they have to migrate, especially the herdsmen have to migrate in search for greener pasture for their cattle towards the north central, of which where I schooled is one of those states, part of the north central, because in Nigeria, we have 36 states in Nigeria. So all of these things is making the center to be weak, because as the farmers and the herdsmen clash, it affects our diversity, because people are seeing it from the religion, ethnic and political perspective. Very little people are seeing it from environmental instability. So I think one of those things that me and probably other organizations are trying to do is to create an awareness, like an education, because where I schooled, I saw the worst impact of the climate change crisis driving farmers and herdsmen to clash, affecting our food security, because it's always leading to loss of life and large displacement of people from their livelihoods, from their home, from every other resources that makes them to be economically vibrant. So when I saw this, I always see comments that relate to ethnic bias, religion bias, political bias, but none of environmental issue arise. So I believe that if you don't educate people, you won't know that a problem exists. So that is the first thing that we are trying to do to these people, to understand this basis, because even you bring solutions that you think will be, that can solve the crisis, it might lead to more problem, because these people doesn't understand where the problem is coming from. They are just seeing the hatred growing between the farmers and the herdsmen that were once at peace with each other. Hence, if we are trying to provide humanitarian aid, or as an humanitarian workers, what we should look for is how we can green humanitarian processes. Just like the Lake Chad issue that I'm advocating for its restoration or for its recharge. I know it's important for the stability of the region, because all of those communities, the Chibok, where about 276 schoolgirls were kidnapped, it's all those places are conflict affected areas. these bandits, they are gaining boundaries because people are losing their livelihoods and there's no alternative path for them to be able to gain a livelihood. So as they are being vulnerable to be recruited by this armed conflict, by this armed group, the Boko Haram and the other kind of terrorist group people. So I think I also wrote it today in today's Daily Mirror. Maybe you could just check it out. It's a UK-based paper too. I wrote it about the armed conflict, how climate change is leading to armed conflict. It's leading to the rise of more weapons, terrorism and the rest. If we could restore Lake Chad, it's going to help to stabilize the region. And if we could find alternative livelihoods for people that will last longer, not always a yearly thing or a quarterly thing that will keep giving them food, it is not sustainable. It is not humanitarian enough. We have to give them something that will make them to be stable. We put food on their table and we give them enough money that will last longer, more than a year, just as a way of stabilizing them so that they don't get vulnerable to be recruited by this armed group of people, hereby leading to insecurity in their society. So humanitarian actors have a lot to do in conflict affected areas by providing alternative livelihoods that is sustainable. Because recently I interviewed someone from Madagascar, and what the thing she mentioned was the fact that there are many people coming on the ground to help, but this help is just like a seasonal help. It is not sustainable. So we need a solution that is sustainable enough for those people that are being displaced, for them to be able to retain their livelihoods, and the society will be able to strive normal. And also restoring Lake Chad as the first and most important process that we must take in order for us to end any form of armed conflict in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adenike. I think that was really interesting discussion of how these different phenomena interact and the effect on lives in your region, and the importance of linking humanitarian work with also sustainable livelihoods, and the importance of education and awareness of how environmental issues and climate change can really drive these conflict issues. So please also add your questions for Adenike in the chat. You can talk to her about her upcoming COP attendance as well. So we'll come back to you in a little while, Adenike, but for now we want to welcome Carol Devine, who is our last but certainly not least panelist. So Carol leads Médecins Sans Frontières Canada's Humanitarian Action on Climate and Environment Initiative, and also Climate Smart MSF. These are projects aiming to help MSF better understand links between climate, environmental degradation and health to inform operational adaptation, mitigation and advocacy. So Carol, another key lesson in the paper is the recommendation that humanitarian actors should respond to the uncertainty of the climate crisis by developing the ability to work in a flexible and adaptive way at individual, program, and organizational levels. So how is MSF adapting to this uncertainty?
Thanks, Jennifer, and I'm honored to be here with the other panelists, and I'd love to echo some of the really important things they're all saying. But this question is really excellent about being flexible, adaptive at the individual, program, and organizational level. I think it's the world has always been uncertain, but as colleagues have just talked about, like what's happening right now is what's going to be the future and even more of. And it's the more we accept that we live in an incredibly complex and interconnected world, the better. And not that I'm into quoting American presidents, at least not more recently, but Eisenhower, a US president, said, planning is useful, but plans are useless. And I think COVID taught us so much. It's still a horror. It's still incredibly destructive. It still reveals systemic racism, and the fact that the important Harvard study that showed that, where people had more COVID was where there was more air pollution and lower income. So I think COVID was the ultimate kind of is the disruptor cascading, as all colleagues have used that word, or colliding and converging with the climate crisis. So from MSF's perspective, we are 66,000 employees around the world in 70 countries. And we've had to add a climate change lens. But if we look retroactively, we were already responding to climate change. And I'll just share a bit of our framing and a bit of the ways we've had to adapt, but learning so much alongside communities and the fact that we're a global movement with many, many partnerships. The IPCC report recently told us that even with the AR6 report that came out in the summer, Code Red for Humanity, in a way, we knew that, but it was another reaffirmation of scientific evidence and joint agreement that even with urgent mitigation, we have to adapt, because the reverberations will be for decades. And the humanitarians will be overwhelmed. And even, this lessons paper is excellent because it even helps us question, what is classic humanitarianism? It's already changed. And for MSF, I keep mentioning COVID because it's still on everyone's minds, and vaccine equity and healthcare equity and gender equity, restrictive border policies, all those things are topics that MSF and others are working on. And, we were doing scenario planning, which was really interesting with the World Meteorological Organization and OCHA and others and ICRC. And it was really useful scenario planning, but that got put on hold. And again, I just come back to COVID as teacher, but so was Ebola. Erin was mentioning about it's really exciting to hear about the Academic Alliance and the impact, understanding. But when we talk about our need to do no harm and our need to be responsive and responsible, I think we also didn't take enough heed of the fact that, to support people and provide healthcare to those most in need, which is MSF's mission number one, provide independent medical needs-based assistance, and then speak out, this advocacy part of our work. Ebola, we had to, act fast. But there was 1 ton of garbage, 1 ton of plastic, 1 ton of medical equipment left over per patient. And we have to help people with COVID, and we have to fight for vaccine equity and access to healthcare. But we also are harming the planet through all of this plastic. So I think our collective voice in the humanitarian sphere to ask suppliers and drug companies to do differently. And I think all of our colleagues, Veronique and Adenike and Mihir, talk about this has to be transformational. This can't be ad hoc, because if it's ad hoc and if it's, one by one, it's a terrible expression, but it's true. We're moving the deck chairs on the Titanic instead of transforming the way we work. So I think, MSF's Doctors Without Borders framing about climate change and the climate crisis, it took us some time to think about it. We had to understand, what do we have the legitimacy to speak about? Well, we are working, and our colleagues are facing it personally as well as in their work. In Bangladesh, colleagues having spontaneous spontaneous miscarriages. And Adenike spoke about awareness too, not understanding why. Are they working too hard? No, it's related to salinity intrusion from sea level rise and saline salt in the agriculture. So, that points to how being adaptive and flexible, it's also about understanding the problem so we can address it better. But the framing I was mentioning, MSF, we've undertaken is, how are we going to adapt our operations with patients and patient-centric care and people-centered policy in the middle? How are we going to adapt our operations? How are we going to speak about it? And what about our footprint? So I'm going to mention just a couple pieces that relate to the question about flexibility and being adaptive. So, and how the humanitarian system and the world has to transform. But we didn't see ourselves working in the United States. We said we work where governments cannot or will not help people. But we found ourselves working in the Navajo Nation. We found ourselves working in Detroit, Michigan, in seniors' homes. Why? Because it's not an outright condemnation of government, but it was because there was a need, and we're good at, or we've learned a lot about infection prevention control and sharing messages and dealing with disinformation and misinformation. We can no longer say we don't do that. And I think that's the stage where we're at with more extreme weather events and the heat waves that Mihir has talked about and the need for change policies. And I think we know the solutions. There's many solutions. There's more to be found. We need to keep our minds open to new solutions. And I know my time is running out, but I note they're not only technical solutions, but there's, MSF is testing and using more solar. It's cheaper. It has health co-benefits. Yes, the return on investment is longer. So other colleagues have talked about where's the money and longer term funding and justice-based funding. But also gender equity is so incredibly important. So not only technical solutions, but solutions that are known about don't blame women, and especially women with larger families, for climate change or overpopulation. Let's look at policy that doesn't support women's sexual reproductive rights, access to family planning, et cetera. So we know the science. MSF is a couple other things we've been doing. Our goals remain the same, but we are looking at applying a climate environmental lens to all our projects. And in Bangladesh, speaking with colleagues, it's also about working with other organizations that have programs about climate resilient cities and migrant friendly cities. We're doing advocacy. We're fighting the fact that at the Mexico border, at the US border, at the Canada border, we're turning away people when public health evidence says include them in the health response, and fueling xenophobia. We need to think differently about funding, about mobility, and we have to push governments and policy too. So we also have a meteorological and climatic anticipation. As I mentioned, we're looking at solar air conditioning much more. And we have to change our energy behavior and recognize, so we're evaluating our footprint. We've used a toolkit in 50 countries that, we're sharing with others and learning from others. So I just want to wrap up by saying that, this uncertainty is with us, and we need some of the gaps I see for us, at least. We need new expertise. We hear from experts about what's going to happen about climate change related to environmental degradation and artisanal mining. We're not good. We're not toxicologists. Also, what about mental health? Really understanding. We've always incorporated mental health, but what about new or just added amplified concerns related to climate change and locally led? COVID made our supply chain is a real problem, meaning it got disrupted. So how do we think about regional and local much more seriously and dedicated? And I lastly want to note that 80% of ecological impact is locked in at the design phase. So let's be sustainable in all our work going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I get the impression you had a lot more to say as well. So please do put questions in the Q&A for Carol. And it's really exciting to hear about all the work that is already underway and the plans for focusing on these issues in the future more within MSF. And I think really interesting to see the shifting needs and flexibility even in the locations where you work and how that might link to future climate crises as well. So I want to pause and just take a question from the audience, and I will look for one for Erin because she won't be able to stay for the full Q&A at the end. So for Erin, the next COP is scheduled to take place in Glasgow at the beginning of November. What would you like to see discussed and committed to in relation to these issues?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot. So I think everyone has pretty high expectations for COP. Let's start with a few things. I did some research last summer looking at humanitarian finance and climate finance and how do those overlap. And what's clear right now is that we are making a big ask for climate finance, and some of that money is new and some of that money is existing money that's being tagged as climate relevant. So we would absolutely focus on asking for climate finance to include new and additional support to humanitarian impacts of climate. And so that can be early warning, early action. It can be other types of resilience investments. But what we also found is if you imagine the disaster continuum, you have disaster risk reduction, preparedness, you have disaster response, and then you have reconstruction and recovery. Climate finance that is going towards disaster risk reduction, preparedness, pre-disaster work tends to have already in its mind some integration between climate and DRR, for example. Those two worlds are very aware of each other, and they do talk, could be better, but we are seeing some movement in that direction. However, when it comes to reconstruction and recovery, you know, humanitarian finance for reconstruction and recovery has very little attention to climate. And I think this is a big problem, because if you have a storm or a disaster, especially one that might have already been made more intense due to climate change, for example, then you're recovering from that. You're doing it in this way of trying to build back what was there and try to recreate what existed before. And if we're talking about transformation, which was one of the key points of this report, the need for transformation, you know, post-disaster recovery is a moment when we can stop and think and look at transformation. So if you're even building back from a non-climate related earthquake, for example, climate change adaptation should be front and center, you know, in that agenda to say, what are our choices as we build back here? How can we take climate into account? How can we look at resilience in all of our work? And especially when we're making choices about rebuilding cities or supporting livelihoods. So that's one potential ask. Certainly another ask would be emissions reductions. We would like to see major commitments and follow through on those commitments for emissions reduction. I mean, yes, we need to be doing adaptation. This is a panel about adaptation. It's mostly my work and adaptation as well. But one of our big asks needs to be that people don't make this problem worse. It's a horrific problem as it is, and we have choices right now about what we're doing going forward. And every little bit of warming matters. Every little bit of warming adds additional risk and causes impacts on vulnerable people around the world. And we need to be having a really hard ask to every government of the world to say, and every company and every individual, this is a serious problem and we need to make very serious decisions about it. I could obviously go on. I will be able to stay a tiny bit longer than I anticipated, which is also good. So I'll happily pass it to someone else and can come back on other asks later.
Great, thanks very much, Erin. So I think that was a really interesting point about maybe not even just building back, but really building forward for the new future that we're anticipating. And you know, while the lessons paper itself didn't focus on mitigation, as Veronique spoke about at the beginning, it doesn't mean that it's not an important part of the discussion. So it's certainly something that we can pick up as well. Thank you. So thus far, I've asked different questions to each member of the panel. I'd now like to ask some of the panel the same questions so we can hear from their different opinions and have the opportunity to build on or challenge each other's view. And they can also take inspiration from the Miro board if they wish. So first off, I want to ask both Erin and Carol the same question, if you can give us a quick 3-minute response. There are lessons emerging and ideas of what works and how we should adapt. But what are the main barriers to us implementing these changes, and how can humanitarian actors overcome them? So I think I'll go to Carol first and then to Erin, since we do have her a little bit longer.
Thanks, Jennifer. And sorry, I was so exuberant and went over time. So that's a great question. What are the barriers? So in my humble experience, I think some of the things I'd like to mention, well, there's systemic barriers, and we need to keep fighting against those. But some of them are our own organizational one. I mentioned one before about we don't do that. So when new colleagues come on board, I say, never let me say to you, we don't do that. We have to be so open-minded today. And I think one way also of overcoming barriers that I didn't mention so deeply in our work to decarbonize and adapt, we also have to decolonize. And I think, you know, it's just so essential. So that's that individual transformation for those of us who need to, you know, really acknowledge that the humanitarian sector has a colonial beginnings, and even today. So I think, you know, so here are some quick notes. Like, patience has been important, waiting for some colleagues to come along, but also indignation and impatience. And I had a colleague say to me, Carol, keep going. Like, either they're on the bus or the bus is leaving. When we know the science, you know, the tipping point is there. I think, like, not talking to deniers, there's no space for that. And I'm not talking about internally, but externally. Like, I think also failure is amazing. I see my MSF colleague Patrick Robitaille asked about the environmental impact toolkit. We made a big quick learning about a barrier was we didn't know how to measure our footprint, but we knew that we needed to measure our footprint. So we made a tool, and it, you know, wasn't perfect, but we had to learn from it. So Adenike mentioned, and I'm sorry, Adenike mentioned bias. So understanding of bias is a barrier, fear of change is a barrier, poor leadership is a barrier, you know, not taking our own leadership is a barrier. And I think, you know, not communicating has been a barrier. We really have to communicate. Science doesn't speak, it's silent, except it's, you know, and I think a barrier has not been really constantly thinking about who is most at risk and who has the solutions, and thinking we know it all. So those are a couple points.
Thanks very much, Carol. I think a lot of that you have there is mindsets, maybe being both a barrier, but also an opportunity if they can be changed and more open. So then to Erin.
Yeah, well, I agree with all these barriers. Maybe would focus on two that are related, but maybe you didn't go into as much detail on. One would be accountability. So this is something we found certainly in the early warning, early action space, but I think it exists across the adaptation world, especially in the humanitarian sector, is whose job is it? And so can you create accountability? And like what you were saying earlier about the process of planning is valuable, because there you are starting to say, this person is responsible for these things, and we are planning in advance that this is on your plate, and you are responsible for looking at climate, you know, you are responsible for considering climate change when you're doing reconstruction, or you are responsible for doing DRR in a way that considers climate change, or when there is a forecast of a heat wave, you are responsible to do this, this, and this. And so creating accountability structures, roles and responsibilities, I think is going to be critical for us. And then of course, finance is a big barrier. So within the some of my work and working with some different IPCC authors, people actually talked a lot about enabling conditions, just essentially barriers, but said a different way. And finance is absolutely one of them. Enabling conditions, governance, and you know, the delegated authority to people who have local knowledge of what's going on and can be allowed to make those decisions.
I'm just removing your...
Okay, sorry about that. My screen was frozen and I was unable to unmute for a minute, but hopefully you can hear me now. So thank you both for those really useful reflections and finding those opportunities amongst the challenges. I think some key things that have been coming up in other sessions as well in relation to other barriers was so these other disruptors that we've seen in different sessions, decolonization, leadership and accountability are all some of the opportunities that are coming out across the sessions. So audience members, please feel free to add your own barriers and opportunities to the Miro board or ask some follow-up questions to our panelists in the Q&A. So now for the three other panelists, I have one question for all of you. What are nationally based organizations or community first responders doing to address climate change threats? And what do you think the role of international humanitarian actors should be or not in supporting them? So first, I'd like to go to Adenike.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. So I feel that NGOs here in Nigeria, they are doing a lot to see that they also play their own parts, and everybody tries to play their part in terms of awareness, climate education, going from one communities to another for grassroots action and the whole rest of the whole thing, trying to see how they can localize climate action, how we can compel our leaders to act on the urgency of climate change, political will, and the rest. Because if we have a country without NGO, they can't strive well, because such country will not be able to do well. They'll not be able to see a push in what they are doing for them to be able to do well and to put more effort to it. And as a matter of fact, according to, from my experience that I had in my university, I tried to see how I can reach out to schools, because we have to take a formal permission from them for us to be able to speak to the students, to the children. And as a matter of fact, it's also important for us to see that the climate education is part of our curriculum, so that it will lessen the stress we all pass through every day in trying to compel people to act, or in trying to see people to see the climate change crisis from our lens, because we are trying to make them to see the need for them to take action collectively, not just us alone. And so if we could have it in our curriculum, it will help to bring more sustainable solutions. It will build a climate smart generation. It will help to fix our climate change crisis or tackle it, because people will know the problem. People will come up with solutions irrelevant, maybe from primary school, secondary school, university, and we keep growing up to become more conscious about what we do with our environment. And most importantly, the role of international organization or humanitarian actors, the fact that we need capacity. We need to be empowered to do more, because an empowered person is someone that will be able to expand its innovativeness to see how they can include more action in dealing with the crisis. So we don't have the capacity to adapt to the current crisis, because we have a lot of finance that is needed to go into climate action, to see that we prevent some things that is difficult for people to adapt, because there's a point that the climate crisis is going to get, that it will become almost impossible for us to adapt to any other changes that is happening in our climate today. So that is why it's important for us to see how we can build the capacity of NGOs or other actors of climate advocacy from the international perspective, how they can build our capacity for us to be able to build the capacity of those people that are being affected by the climate change crisis. And most important too, I think empowerment could come in any form or in any capacity. It can be materials that are needed for us to support those people that are in dire need of humanitarian aid in such a way that it will be sustainable, that will have jobs, like creation of green jobs, bringing new innovation on the table, championing all of this through sustainable finance, in making humanitarian action to be seen, to be feasible enough for people to be able to reduce the number of displacement or refugee. Because right now in Nigeria, we have several internally displaced people camps all across the country, and it's a very big issue right now, because it's leading to the rise of crime and several insecurities that we are seeing in our society. We are also seeing the increase in kidnapping, a very big crisis that we are seeing in our time. So international humanitarian actors have a lot to do in seeing that they help us to build capacity for us to be able to deal with this crisis, and creating different empowerment channels for us to be able to reach out to these people from the grassroots, from education, innovativeness, different kind of ways that we can use to champion humanitarian aid, or to bring humanitarian aid for this solution to be sustainable, long-lasting solution, because that is what we need currently, because short-term solutions are no longer working, giving them food, giving them water. We need something that is lasting, that these people will not be further vulnerable to any form of crisis, for them to reduce vulnerability so that they don't become a victim of armed conflict, or they are not forced to join armed group. Because I once saw a report that stated the fact that in the area of the Lake Chad region, some of these parents have to tell their children to go out there and join this armed group of people so that they can earn money. It's a reality here for us in Nigeria, in other African countries that are also hit hardest by the climate change crisis that is leading to armed conflict. They have to send their children to go there to go and get something so that they can survive. So in the process of survival issue, it becomes detrimental to the society and to us, to our peace and to our security. And that is important, that we need international assistance as we take local action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adenike. So I think there's real sense that education and young people are really key to making this work in the future. But also there's a real potential for innovation, that there needs to be more empowerment and more resources to help local organizations really maximize that potential. Thank you. So again, we'll come back to you again with more questions from the audience. But for now, I'd like to hear Mihir's thoughts on that same question. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. And I think there is no choice but to transform the humanitarian system and various aspects of that. There is absolutely no choice. And one of the first things that we can do is to make use of the report that we have just coming out. At local level, national level, things are changing, and let me give you some examples. For example, UNICEF in India is working with schools to have more water during the heat waves, if we take that, or change the timing of the schools so that children don't have to come back from school in the middle of the heat in the afternoon. Or for example, if we take IFPRI, International Food Institution, and its partner, they are working with family farmers to see that the farmers' production as well as their grain storage is done differently, to make sure that the impact of, again, heat wave, if we take that as an example, is done differently. There's a small but very vibrant local organization, Mahila Housing Trust, which is providing housing finance and housing technical assistance to a large number of women to build their homes in the low-income slums very differently, so they can have what is called cool roofs, and roof which will protect the work being done inside the home and people who live inside the home at a very low cost. And the list can go on and on. That Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, for example, has a budget line in that annual budget, which is heat wave response budget. And those are the kind of local changes that are happening. And the role of international organizations, both donors and UN and the national governments of the donor country, is fourfold. One is to support these changes that are taking place, not replace them with new initiatives. Second is to have sustained and direct investment, which will not divert the efforts, but actually leverage the effort, so that what is being done and is being effective will be far more effective. Third is to find the space and give space and resources for various ways of working, because there is no single way of working as far as response is concerned, as far as transformative response is concerned. And the last, which is said very well in the panel, is to anticipate reaction, early action. So in the end, I would like to sum up that we can't build back better anymore. We can't. We have to build back greener, and we have to build back cleaner. Unless we build back greener and cleaner, there is no transformation. We will be only rebuilding things which will collapse again in one way or the other. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Mihir. So again, you're giving examples of what local organizations and local governments are already doing and working against these disasters, which are in some ways relatively unknown to the humanitarian community, and an ask there for that to be greater supported. Thank you. So it'd be useful to hear from Veronique as well, from the perspective of an international organization. What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, in fact, we organized our last autumn school on humanitarian aid on the issue of local responses to crisis, with a focus on informal citizen and community-led responses to disaster, trying to go beyond local NGOs and local authorities who have a crucial role in responding to crisis, of course. So we were able to reflect on the way we, as international humanitarian aid specialists, view the populations affected by crisis and how this view can influence our postures and practices. And indeed, I believe that we all share a collective psyche embedded in the Roman proverb, homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. I think we believe that the law of the jungle, the law of the strongest, is imposed on human beings by nature. But how many studies question this idea that nature is all about competition and fighting for survival. There are many examples in nature where animals or individuals work together for survival. And these studies showed that the more hostile and resource poor the environment, the more living beings cooperate. On the other hand, the richer the environment is, where nature is more abundant, then competition often takes over. So contrary to the idea that in adversity, it is everyone for themselves, in extreme situation all over the world and almost naturally, what predominates is mutual aid. And in fact, during Hurricane Katrina, for example, when entire towns were deprived of help, electricity, means of communication, and any form of authorities, people and communities organized themselves in a surprisingly calm manner and developed an incredible surge of solidarity over several days and weeks. And in fact, in many places all over the world, humanitarian workers witness this mutual aid. Groupe saw this clearly in Beirut last year after the blast. And we can see that in almost all crisis situations, it is not panic that dominates, but a great calm, as if this situation restore a certain sense of priorities. But in many situations, we as humanitarian aid specialists, not only we do not know how to support this mutual aid, how to strengthen it, to coordinate with it, to work together, but in fact, by ignoring it, our action can weaken it and do harm. These examples of solidarity in adversity open the path to another narrative. It questions our practices, our organizations, our procedures, the system as a whole. And I think that we need to learn now how to strengthen this mutual aid and how to relate to informal organizations and citizen-led responses. This may start by changing the narrative, telling ourselves another story in order to get better prepared for the storms to come. And for us at Groupe, it is an exciting emerging research area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronique. So I think that's really useful, the way you've highlighted that maybe in some ways, as the international community comes in, that it can do some harm to these local structures of cooperation, and as you've called it, mutual aid that emerge after a disaster. Great, so that was really useful to hear all three of you with those varied responses to a question that we've been asking quite a lot in this meeting so far in relation to various forms of disruption and the respective roles of different types of organization. There was also some reflection yesterday that the threat of climate change is so big that collaborative efforts across the sector may be needed to tackle it, but this should really be through more equal partnerships that really recognize the value of local perspectives. So I think that's enough questions from the chair. So let's take some more from the audience. I could see quite a few coming in. So I'll look at the ones that have been upvoted by others. So there's a question here from Bernard that are there one or two key climate resources that you would recommend that can help staff involved in strategic planning who may be thinking about climate change adaptation for the first time and how climate should be considered or integrated throughout strategy as a cross-cutting theme? So I think I'll go to Erin first and then to Carol for this one.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe I should even type links in the chat. It might be easier than hearing me say these resources out loud, but I'll see them.
I think that would be really helpful. There's a lot of people asking for links to what you've all been talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So one key one I would recommend, the Red Crescent Climate Center has put together a climate training kit. So that has a lot of resources in it. It has links outwards, so you can kind of go through it. It's got games that you can use when you need to facilitate discussions with your colleagues. So it's really quite a nice toolkit. Goodness. I suppose it looks, there's a good question of, what level of detail do you need? So if you need climate information about what kind of trends to expect in a region, the IPCC recently released an interactive atlas. So you can click around and visualize climate trends, which they've done it in just such a nice way that makes this much more accessible to everyone in the world. So I can put that link as well. The World Bank has some interesting screening tools, and they have some interesting country profiles that also look at projected impacts on agriculture and things like that. So those would maybe be three very different tools depending on the kind of question you're asking. I don't know if others have other ideas. I can drop the links in the chat.
That would be really helpful if you can share those with others. So Carol, if you have any others, and I can also see a question asking you about the MSF Environmental Impact Toolkit as well. So if you could speak to those.
Sure. I echo the resources. ICRC has really excellent ones, and they've even put some of their kind of planning out there. I can find that link and add it. I want to mention some of the resources that are coming up towards COP26, which may not be so much about, that great question about, how to integrate it into your planning, but it will help with the argumentation, some of the policy recommendations, and I think they'd be worth looking at. And so two that I'll mention, one is the Lancet Countdown, Tracking Progress on Health and Climate Change, that comes out on Thursday. MSF has a humanitarian brief for the 4th time, but it's really also worth looking at the country briefs and the overall kind of recommendations. And then there's a new WHO report. I'll put the link on. It's the health argument for climate action. So once again, this is just thinking about, the impact problem statement and some policy recommendations. On the environmental impact toolkit, very, very quickly, in 2018, I said, how are we going to adapt our operations? How are we going to speak about it? There was reticence to do a lot until we understood our own footprint. We felt hypocritical. We felt like we need to do no harm, so we need to begin to measure. And really what I can tell you super high level is it really matters to measure, because it opens conversations, it opens immediate changes, it opens policy changes, it opens understanding and communication. So this toolkit was an Excel-based tool. We looked at other tools. People were very generous in the humanitarian and private sector, and we just started to measure. And so now we're committed to the Paris targets, so the tool will become more enhanced, but there's a movement within, ICRC and ALIMA and others who are also sharing tools, carbon tools and waste tools. And what I can say is, in using it over 50 projects and countries in MSF, so much good has come from it. We've improved the tool, but we've also said, let's do this about fleet, let's do this about air travel, let's do this about waste practices and circular economy. So I'll share a link to that as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's great to hear of so many resources that people can pick up on from this session. So I'll ask the next question to Adenike. So you will be attending the COP next month. How much faith do you put in large international conferences like this to bring about real change and improvement on these issues? I see if Adenike is still with us or if she has had to drop off. Adenike, can you hear me? I can see you still on there. Okay, I think we'll move on, and if she can rejoin, and she can let me know that she's here, and we can pass that question back to her. But at the moment, I'll go to a question for Veronique. So the lessons paper reviewed a lot of existing studies of humanitarian responses to climate-related disasters. What are the gaps in knowledge that you think still need to be filled? What have we not learned yet?
Yeah, well, I think I would respond to this question with two parts, two elements. First, to echo what Erin said in her first presentation. When doing our research, we realized that there was often only very weak evidence in support of approaches that are becoming or have already become core humanitarian policy when responding to climate-related disasters. This means that current approaches and practice have been enthusiastically adopted despite there being little to no evidence of whether they will be effective in addressing climate-related disaster. So evidence was particularly weak for anticipatory approaches and for efforts by humanitarian actors to support resilience. So this is really exactly the point Erin said. So I think we really welcome the initiative to build knowledge and to evaluate properly what works and what doesn't work in this kind of anticipatory and resilience building approaches. So this is my first point. And the second element, going beyond, as I said earlier, I think that climate change is a major disruptive element coming, but still partly lying ahead for the future, even if we see already impacts of this climate change, but the real changes are coming. Impacts on the ecosystems will be profound and long-lasting, from the oceans to glaciers, having impacts on livelihoods, on our ways of life, of work, of relating to each other. So the lessons learned from existing literature is not as disruptive as it should be to respond to the effect of climate change, in fact. There will be many more lessons to learn when the humanitarian system will be overwhelmed by the level of needs, and both in southern countries and northern countries. And when this kind of effects of the climate change will have to lead to systemic changes, in fact. This is why learning is not yet as disruptive, I would say, as it should be. And I think that it is why it has to become a real-time process, part of adaptive and agile management. We have to learn by doing, by responding to what is coming. So yeah, there is still quite a lot of lack of knowledge. Sure.
Thank you, Veronique. Yes, I think the lessons paper has a lot of lessons in it. So we've got 40 in there, but then also there is a reflection on the end about what we still need to learn, and a call to action for others to help fill out that evidence gap as well as we move forward. Thank you, Veronique. So another question, I will pass this one to Mihir. This is from Chrisant, who says, I found it interesting that there is no lessons related to how humanitarian actors should design programs by understanding the needs and capacities of people with disabilities and older people in managing climate risks. Any explanations about this gap? So Mihir, are you able to answer that? I think we may have lost Mihir as well. I think it's potentially an issue of people being dropped out on one side of the platform, but still being logged in on Zoom, because I can still see their names, but there is no response. So I think if we just go back to Veronique, maybe just for a quick reflection on that as the other author, and then we'll pass another question to Carol in a moment.
Well, in fact, I'm quite sure that there are some lessons, maybe not in the first part, but in the two other parts about being inclusive in the design of responses. So I will invite you maybe to go further into the documents, and not only in the first part. As I explained before, we had to organize the lessons paper around 3 parts. And I would say the 40 lesson has to be seen all together, even if they are the result of 3 different literature reviews. But I'm sure that, because it is indeed a key lesson to include vulnerable and marginalized people and community into the design.
Thank you, Veronique. And yes, I recall one of the lessons in the paper speaking about people's different capacities and different resources that they can draw on, which does get into questions, I think, of age and also gender within that. So maybe some are more explicit than others, but certainly something maybe people can look at more in the future. And I think we'll be talking about some of those issues in another session, not necessarily to do with climate change, but due to other disruptors in the rest of this ALNAP meeting. So thank you for that, Veronique. So I have a question for Carol, saying that you had a point that they think you said 90% of our environmental impact is locked in at the design stage. We do have some donor stances to encourage us to be more green, for example, DG ECHO. In your opinion, what other elements are needed for real change in our work?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And it was 80% of ecological design, 80% of ecological impact is locked in at the design phase. So what that tells us is that policy very, very much helps, but so does awareness. And so you have, companies have these ESG reports, environmental, social governance, but what MSF is doing too is we're working with some others on a we think about in procurement, a code of conduct about social responsibility, child labor, slave labor, prison labor, but we also need that ecological part to it. And I think that's something that we can share amongst ourselves more too. And what we learned from campaigning for access to affordable essential medicines was our bulk buying. When we said $10,000 per person per patient for life-saving drugs that are cheap in Canada or the UK is unacceptable, and we put pressure on companies. And I think it's the same, I think different donors expecting it, but also us expecting it of ourselves and saying, let's look at our list of, I think something like, some 60% of our footprint in bigger organizations can be others' footprint, the drugs we procure, the food we procure. So what are they doing, and asking of them and demanding of them that it be ecological. And then I think too, in our own practices, when we set up a new clinic, think green. I had a colleague in Nigeria tell me there's a new clinic going in and there's not a shred of ecological, thought put into it. And then others are saying, colleagues are demanding for, or they're just pushing through solar or better energy practices. So once it becomes an organizational collective commitment. It's better than just, fighting ad hoc. And so having your own, we made our own environmental pact, and we're looking at the ICRC charter. That helps too, to accountability to ourselves and asking that of those we spend donor money on. Thank you.
Thanks very much for answering that one, Carol. So I think Erin also had to leave us, but I can see one question in there from Alexandra asking to remind us of the name of the academic group or consortium she mentioned. I think it was the Academic Alliance. So you can look that one up for more information, but it sounded like a great group of different universities from around the world working on these issues. So really looking forward to seeing more on that. I can see that Mihir is back with us. So Veronique took a question explaining whether the lessons paper took into account the needs of older people or people with disabilities. Mihir, could you just give us maybe 60 seconds of your view on that before we have to wrap up?
Yes, yes, we have looked at the material available, published that we have used, and as per the guidelines of ALNAP, in what material to use and what is, with high credential and high, and some of that included, for example, again, impact of heat wave on older people of certain age group, and also looked at the people of certain disabilities or challenges. But to tell you the truth, there isn't much material on that. And that's an area where far more research and documentation and impact studies and even ethnographic studies are needed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mihir. And I think that is one of the challenges of a lessons paper methodology, is that something may be important, but if the resources didn't come out as already existing in the search, then it's not going to be included as one of the main lessons that may be included within this call for future research and a future focus. So I think that is all we have time for, I'm afraid, in this session, but please do keep these conversations going, because this is an issue that will require more action and more learning in the coming years. Based on the discussion with the panelists and the inputs from you, the audience, it seems that we're already seeing some evolution of the existing ways of working that take the effects of climate change more into account in humanitarian operations and in our planning. However, these evolutions may need to move towards revolutions, and I think we saw a strong push for that from several of the panelists, and that we need more transformative change if we're to be well equipped to face the uncertainty of exactly what hazards will emerge as a result of climate change. These may be particularly in relation to issues of funding models and who takes the lead in meaningful partnerships. We may also see a growing need for countries in the so-called global north to be taking lessons from the so-called global south, as climate change makes its effects increasingly known in places that have perhaps been less prone to humanitarian disasters in the past. So my colleague has already dropped a link to the chat in the new ALNAP's lessons paper on adapting humanitarian action to climate change. It will also be made available in the resources section of the platform. And if you have any questions or comments after reading it, please do get in touch with me via email. Some of us will be continuing the discussion in the networking session after this, so please feel free to click on the link, which you'll find at the top, and you can drop down to the networking room and join us if you want to talk a bit more. So it only remains for me to say a sincere thank you to all our panelists for their time and their insights, and also to our active audience for your thought-provoking questions. Please keep in mind that this session is one of the Disrupting Humanitarian Practice series that is running throughout this 3-day meeting. So if you're interested in this theme, please do check the agenda for other sessions within this series. And I apologize for my own disruptor throughout this meeting with the unruly earbud. So thank you for sticking with me. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the ALNAP meeting and the remainder of your day. Thank you, everyone, and take care.